to work. Okay, then, so we're going to have, for the Daf Yomi today, Daf Lamed. And let's just review very quickly what we saw on Daf Chav Tes Amud Beis. The Gemara was medayik from the Mishnah that the sul of Lulav HaGazl, as well as Lulav HaYavesh, applies all 7 days. And the Gemara says, I understand why the psul of Yavesh should apply for 7 days, because the Torah requires hadar. And this is not a lulav if it's so dry that it's brittle. But with regard to Gazl, I understand that Gazl is not lachem, but the Torah only requires lachem on the first day and not for the balance of Yontif. And that led Rabbi Yochanan to present his thesis at the top of Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, that the reason why Gazl is possible all 7 days has nothing to do with lachem, and it's not a reflection of the lack of ownership, but rather it's because of the principle of mitzvah baba avera. And this is where we're going to start today's daf, shenemar, on the second line on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. And now Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, is going to derive the principle of mitzvah baba avera from a pasuk at the end of Tanakh in Sefer Malachi. The Navi is giving tochacha, rebuking the Kohanim for being mevaza es hakodshim. And the Navi says, "Va'avesem gazul v'es hapiseach v'es hachola." And then at the end of the pasuk it says, "Ha'ertza osa miyedchem omer Hashem." HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not want to receive and accept their korbanos. Why? Because they are stolen, or they are, piseach means their legs are broken. The legs of the animal are broken, and that gives the animal a status of a balmum, or cholim, the animal are deathly ill. And now Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is going to read this pasuk carefully, and he sees that in the sequence there's gazul, then piseach, and then chola. Apparently, the Torah, the Nach, went out of its way to connect gazul with piseach, as opposed to chola, because if the equation was between gazul and chola, then the word gazul should have been placed at the end of this series, following the word chola. The reason why gazul was placed first on the list is in order to connect it with the juxtaposition to piseach, where the animal has broken legs. And there's a fundamental difference in between, if an animal is a chola, then there's a good chance that if we apply and administer therapeutic help, we can now bring the animal back to its previous state of health. But in the case of a piseach, its legs are broken, there's no way. Dumya, gazul, dumya to piseach. So we have now an equation between gazul and piseach. Ma piseach lesli takanta. Just like the case of piseach, the carbon has no takana. You can't wait. You can't fix it up. It's pasuli olam. And that's called a mum kavua she'ein lo refuah. Af gazul, also dumya de piseach, is pasuli olam. Lesle takanta. Nothing you could do would change the status of a carbon gazul. It's pasuli olam. Loshno lifnei yeush, v'loshno liachar yeush. It matters not whether we heard yeush. Rashi says that after the animal was stolen, the owner declared, "Vai li l'chisaron kis," woe to me that I have suffered this financial loss. And that's considered a language of yeush, in which the Bailim have expressed their despair and the lack of any optimistic hope that they would be able to retrieve their lost, or I should say stolen, object. And despite the fact that the original owner was Misyayich, he declared his despair, And that, for example, in Aveda would be a perfectly complete kinyan, but nevertheless, it doesn't matter because the Torah went out of its way to compare Gazel to Piseach to teach me Ein Lo Takana, even Liachar Yeush. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, Bishlei Melifnei Yeush. I understand why a carbon that was stolen, and if the Bailim, the victim of the theft, would not have given up hope, that's called Lifnei Yeush, then for sure, Shimon the thief could not bring that carbon because it belongs to Reuven. And Adam ki Yaakov mikem carbon Lashem Amar Rachmana. The Torah says it's got to be mikem, and mikem means michalachem. You have to be the owner of the animal. You can't bring someone else's stolen animal. But Lavdi Deu, it's not his, but Liachar Yeush, we have halacha, which replies to movable objects, metaltalin, that Tanya B'Yeush, that when a Gazlan steals something, a movable object, and the Bailim, the Nigzal, declares Yeush, under such circumstances, the Gazlan is Kone, he acquires ownership over the object, in this case, over the stolen animal. And therefore, when the Ganav, the Gazlan, will be Magdish the animal and bring it as a carbon, he's bringing his own carbon. Why then does the Pasuk in Malachi indicate that the carbon remains possible beyond a Gazlan even after the Bailim or Misyayish? Elolav, we have no other choice. Bishum dahavile mitzvah ba'aver, because the acquisition and the access that the Gazlan was able to achieve the animal, to get hold of the animal, in order to bring it as a carbon, was through the act of Gzela. And that's, of course, an Avera. And now we're going to apply this principle to the case of a stolen lulav. Even if, after stealing the lulav, the Bailim were Misyayish, nevertheless, the lulav remains possible, and that's under the category of mitzvah ba'aver. The chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan in interpreting our Mishnah is that our Mishnah applies the psul of mitzvah ba'aver not just to the first day of the 7 days of Chag, but to all 7 days. And therefore, when the Mishnah, as we said, lo shna yontif rishon, lo shna yontif sheni, meaning the balance of the Chag, the other 6 days, a guzzle like a Yovish is possible, that's because of mitzvah ba'aver. Now, in a moment, Rabbi Yochanan is going to quote Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, who has another alternative source from which he derives in a pasuk in Yeshayahu the principle of mitzvah ba'aver. But before we get to that, let's just make one or two comments here. How does Rabbi Yochanan know? This is the great chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan, that the psul of mitzvah ba'aver applies all 7 days. But in truth, we could have asked a more fundamental question on this whole sugya that we're learning. Why does the Gemara assume that the psul of Yavesh applies all 7 days? There are many psulim that disqualify the lulav only on the first day and not for the balance of the Chag. So, for example, lachem, the requirement that it's got to be your lulav, only applies on the first day, doesn't apply on the balance of the other 6 days of the Chag. Chaser, for example, if a piece of the lulav was removed, assuming we have most of the lulav intact, that lulav is kosher for the last 6 days, the balance, but not for the first day. So we have a fundamental distinction between the lulav on the first day and the lulav during the balance of the Chag. In fact, the Gemara is going to establish that the 6 days of Chag after the first day, the mitzvah of lulav is only d'Rabbanan. It's the takana of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai Zeichel Mikdash. Only in the Mikdash was the lulav d'oraisa for all 7 days. And in the context of a d'Rabbanan, which is the categorization of lulav for the end of the Chag, we don't necessarily have the same psula. On the other hand, the situation is very complicated because we do have psulim that apply not only on the first day, but even on the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of lulav, the balance of the Chag. For example, the Gemara says that you need lekicha tama, and you have to take all 4 minim, and that requirement applies for all 7 days. And then we have hadar, and yavesh is a psul of hadar, and that applies all 7 days. Lulav hayavesh, kapasik, bein yom rishon, bein yom sheni, is pasik. So one of the most profound issues in the first Mishnah in this perek is finding the guidelines. When do we apply the psulim of Yom Tov Rishon in lulav to all 7 days? And when do we say it only applies in the first day and not the balance of the Chag? One rule is that if you don't have the Daled Minim, then you don't have a Zeichel Amigdash. You can't create a Zeichel Amigdash and create a new mitzvah of 3 minim. It's got to be all 4 minim or bust. Another principle is that the minim have to have a shame. It's got a shame. Lulav, at one point, it loses its shame lulav. That's not so in the case of chaser, but it would be so in the case of yavish. And the chiddush here, the breakthrough of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, is that the psul of mitzvah baba vera completely undermines the status of the mitzvah. It cancels the mitzvah itself. And therefore that cancellation and that invalidation applies all 7 days. We'll soon see that Shmuel disagrees. Now we have a second source from which we derive mitzvah baba zera as a psul in mitzvah. The Yomer Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Ma'idach Siv. How do we explain a pasuk in Yeshayahu? Ki ani Hashem ohev mishpat sonei gazel bi'olah. God makes a declaration that he cannot tolerate, he finds repulsive, a stolen carbon olah. Why single out a carbon olah? He could have spoken about Asham, about Chatos, about Shlomim. There's some extra chidush here in the word olah and in the carbon olah, if it's stolen. And Reb Shimon Bar Yochai explains it with a mashal. Mashal melech basav adam shaya over al beis hameches. There was a house that was dedicated for collection of taxes, and every member of the community, when he passed that house, he would have to go in and pay his taxes. Now, the king, together with his servants and the entire entourage, passes this beis hameches. The king turns to his eved, to his servants, and he declares, "Tnu meches lamoktzim," pay up taxes. Amru lo. What do you mean? All the taxes are going to you. You're the king. You accrue all those funds, and now you're going to pay taxes? Hello, kol meches kula shel chai. Amalehem. If the people see that even the king himself did not pass the Beis HaMeches without entering and paying his dues, then how much more so we have to do the same. We will not pass the entrance into the Beis HaMeches without going in to pay our taxes. What's the nimshal? Afa Kodesh Baruch Hu Omar, he declares, Ani Sonei Gezel Biola. Well, someone stole a carbon and he brings it as an ola. It's going to Hashem. And Hashem says, I don't want to accept this ola, even though the ola is completely for Hashem. Let my children follow and emulate my example. And they will stay far away from Gezel. And just like a Kodesh Baruch Hu despises Gezel in the case of a carbon olah, so too he despises Gezel in all mitzvahs. And therefore, a mitzvah baba vera, where the only access The only facilitation of your mitzvah was an avera. You stole it. Rosh Baruch Hu says, it's repulsive in my eyes, and I totally reject it. Herein, perhaps, lies the secret of why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, why Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Shimon Bar Yochai, wanted to quote a second pasuk as a second source for the principle of mitzvah baba avera. If we only had the first source, then mitzvah baba avera means don't benefit from gezel. So, for example, if you steal a carbon and you bring it as a carbon chatas, or even better, let's say take the case of a shlom, you benefit from a carbon shlom. The meat of the carbon will be divvied up. The kohanim will get part of it, and the bailim will get part of it, even though they're not kohanim. And even in case of a chatas and osham, although the bailim can't eat the carbon because it's kodshim, but nevertheless they get credit with the kohen by supplying the meat to the kohen, and they'll choose which kohen will eat the meat. Perhaps I don't know. You have to know the laws of pious. But be that as it may, in the case of an olah, the thief gains nothing from the olah. All he does is bring a carbon. The carbon is kulo kolil, is completely burnt on the mizbeach. Nothing is designated for achilas adam. It's all achilas mizbeach. And therefore, you might think in that case, there's no psul of mitzvah baba avera. Mashma lan, the pasuk in Yeshayahu, adds to the pasuk in Micha that not only is there a psul of mitzvah baba avera, I'm sorry, the pasuk in Malachi, I meant to say, not only is there a psul of mitzvah baba avera when the gazlan benefits, he has hanas haguf from the theft, but even if he gets no hano whatsoever, it's a carbon olah, it's kula kolil, still the Torah invalidates that carbon under the psul of mitzvah baba. Itmanami, the Gemara wants to bring an amora to support Rabbi Yochanan that lulav hagazel is disqualified for the entire celebration, the entire holiday of Sukkot because of mitzvah baba avera. Amar Rav Ami Yavesh Posel Mipnei Ein Bo Hadar. We have to disqualify a lulav hayavesh for all of Sukkot because it's not called a lulav unless it's hadar, as Tosfos quotes at the beginning of that chapter, a ekesh between esrog and lulav, both of which are mandated in the same pasuk, and the Torah describes the esrog as creates hadar, and without hadar, it's not called an esrog, and the same applies to a lulav. Hence, yavesh is posel kol shiva, and so too, Gazel is possible also for all 7 days. We see explicitly that Rav Ami complies with the understanding of Rabbi Yochanan, the name of Shimon Bar Yochai, that the psul of Lulav HaGazel for all 7 days is based on mitzvah haba b'avera. The later commentaries ask the following question: Minayin leGemara sherav Ami sover kedas Rabbi Yochanan shalulav hagazel pasuk kol b'me'achag b'shemitzvah haba ba'avera. Shema sover kedas Shmuel she'ein omer mitzvah haba ba'avera ela b'mitzvah d'oraisa shel leil rishon shel yom rishon. Uma she'omer shalulav hagazel pasuk mishum mitzvah haba ba'avera hainu dafka b'yontav rishon shehu d'oraisa. Ubi ofen shenikna legazlan b'yeir shekvar edo posel mishutenu shalachema b'shar yemos hachag kosher. He says maybe when the statement of Rav Ami explains that lulav hayavesh and lulav hagazel are posel, yavesh because of the chisaron of hadar and gazel because of mitzvah b'avera, it might be true that gazel, that hadar is possible for all 7 days, but it doesn't say explicitly in the words of Rav Ami that gazel is possible for all 7 days. He just mentions that the underlying reason for the psul is mitzvah b'avera. If an event that the stolen lulav is after Yeruch, after the gazlan was kona. There's no chisaron of lachem, but there's a chisaron of mitzvah b'avei. But maybe that only applies to the first day, which indeed is going to be Shmuel Shita coming around the bend. But apparently, from the fact that he equates Yavesh and Guzzle, and he starts with Yavesh, and then he goes on to Guzzle, what he meant to convey is that the psul of Yavesh is Kol Shiva, all 7 days, and likewise the psul of Guzzle is Kol Shivas Yavesh. And then Rav Ami gives the underlying logic. The reason why Guzzle is possible is because of Mitzvah B'Avera. Apparently, Mitzvah B'Avera applies for all 7 days. We have now a statement of Rabbi Yitzchak in the name of Shmuel that rejects the principle of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of ambition. Lo shadu el b'yotif rishon. When the Mishnah says that lulav hagazel is possible, it's only referring to the first day. And the reason it's possible on the first day is because lachem, the Torah requires ownership, and there is no lachem in the case of a lulav hagazel. Will be on Tivsheni, but with regard to the balance of sukkahs, where it doesn't say lachem, is mitoch sheyotze b'shoul, yotze nami b'lulav hagazel. Just like if I would borrow your lulav, I could fulfill my mitzvah of lulav for the balance of the chag because the Torah doesn't require lachem. So too in the case of gazel, even though it's not my lulav, it's yours, I stole it from you. Nevertheless, I can fulfill my mitzvah during the balance of the chag because there is no requirement of lachem. And now the question arises, does Shmuel reject the principle of mitzvah b'avera, which is a psul in every single mitzvah, a stolen matzah and a stolen lulav? So if you take a look at one line Tosfos on the bottom of the Amud, Tosfos says, Hacha dafka shumir rabbanan lo chayish on mitzvah b'avera. Rabbanan, when they made a takana of lulav for the 6 days of Chag, that's only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, as opposed to the first day, which is a mitzvah d'Oraisa. So when we have a psul of mitzvah b'aver, that only applies to a d'Oraisa. But to a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, we don't have a psul of mitzvah b'aver. So the Nod of Yehud is famous for asking the question, why not? We have a principle called the Tikkun Rabbanan came d'Oraisa Tikkun. So why didn't the Rabbanan establish lulav for the balance of the chag in the same way with the same requirements of lulav d'oraisa on the first day? Why should Shmuel assume that mitzvah b'aver will only disqualify a mitzvah d'oraisa first day, but not a mitzvah d'Rabbanan? But here the Nod of Yehuda comes up with an amazing chiddush, and he says that there's a much more fundamental machlokas here between Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel about the nature and the definition of mitzvah b'aver. Says the Nod of Yehuda, whereas Rabbi Yochanan understood that the psul of mitzvah b'aver derived from the psukim in Malachi and Yeshayahu is a psul d'oraisa, and hence it would apply even to a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, like lulav kol shiva, under the principle of kol the tikkun Rabbanan came d'oraisa tikkun. That's Rabbi Yochanan Shita. Shmuel never bought into that. Shmuel understood that any yalfusas, any derivations from Malachi or from Yeshayahu Hanavi, they establish a psul d'Rabbanan of mitzvah b'avera. And we don't piggyback a psul d'Rabbanan onto a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. That's already called trei d'Rabbanan, a double d'Rabbanan. Maser Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman is going to now raise an objection to Rav Yitzchak in the name of Shmuel. Lulav hagazel vayovesh pasul. The Mishnah only mentions gazel, and by implication it means hasha'ul kasher. The Mishnah is implying that a borrowed lulav is kasher. Otherwise, it would have told me a bigger thing that even if you borrow a lulav, it's possible. Amos. What day of Sukkot is the Mishnah referring to? How could you be Yotze with someone else's lulav on the first day when the Torah stipulates it's got to be yours? Hi lavdi day. And even though you should know in certain laws a shoel is considered a bailin, that's only as far as achrayus in the zikin is concerned. So if I borrow your animal and I ride your animal, if the animal damages someone else, I'm responsible as if it's my animal. But as far as pure bailus is concerned, legal ownership, it's not mine. And therefore it's not lochem. We therefore have no choice but to interpret the Mishnah sheni, where you don't require lachem, and therefore by implication the Mishnah is teaching me that shoel is kosher called shiva, even though I don't own it because the Torah doesn't require ownership. Uketani gazel pasul. A lulav hagazel is pasul kol shiva. How could Rabbi Yitzchak say in the name of Shmuel that lulav hagazel is only pasul on the first day of Sukkot? Omar Rava comes to defend Shmuel. The Olam, the Yontif. The Mishnah is talking about the first day of Sukkot, and you want to be medayek from our Mishnah that shoel is pasul? No. Shoel is certainly pasul on the first day, but lomi boika. We have to learn the Mishnah as an ein tzarich lomar, which means the following: lomi boy shoel. I don't even have to tell you shoel. That goes without saying. In Yiddish, we say that's upgeret. I don't have to tell you that shoel is pasul yontif rishon belavti deu. But gazel, you would have a havamin. Ema stam gzela yeush bailim. What is gzela? Gzela means when a gazlan accosts a person, he encounters him face to face, your money or your life. The nigzal realizes he's dealing with a very dangerous robber, and immediately he gives up hope, and he despairs, and he doesn't hold out any hope for getting back his stolen object. That's called yeush, and the Gemara applies a principle called stam gzela yeush bailim. Is therefore the gazlan now through yeush made an acquisition, and he was koneh the gzela with yeush, and therefore kedidei dani, it's his because he was koneh with yeush. If that be the case, then gazel should be kosher on the first day because it is lochem after yeush bailim. Kamash malon, the Tan of our Mishnah wants to tell me that even though a person steals something face to face in front of the bailim, we don't have to assume that the bailim were misyash. The Mishnah wants to tell me we don't apply a principle of stam gzela yeush bailim until we hear from the nigzal explicitly, and he declares kiss, then we assume that he's not misyash. He does not give up hope. He's going to put up signs, wanted, dead or alive, with a graphic artist he's going to pay to have a picture of the gazlan. So even though, as Rashi explains, he realizes the gazlan is stronger than him, the gazlan was able with power and might to take away his lulav, but nevertheless, be asid in the future, etbal sola bezdin, I'm going to utilize the courts. I have recourse to get back my stolen lulav, and therefore I'm not misyash. And if there's no yeush, then the gazlan has not been koneh, hence the lulav is pasul on the first day, but not for the balance of sukkot. It's not pasul under the psul of lachem because there is no requirement of lachem for the rest of sukkot, and it's not pasul b'toras mitzvah b'avera because Shmuel holds that in a mitzvah d'Rabbanan like lulav called shiva, there is no psul of mitzvah b'avera. Now we have a sugya Rav Huna, which is an extension of the sugya that we've been learning until now. Amalahu Rav Huna lahani avankare. Avankare are merchants that buy and sell, and they're Jewish merchants, they buy and sell a host of different commodities, but we're going to talk about a case of Avankari who are buying hadassim, which is called in Aramaic asa, and they're selling it to the Jews for Sukkahs. So Rav Huna has an instruction to the Avankari who are purchasing the hadassim from non-Jews. So you have a field that's owned by John Paul Jones, and he is growing hadassim. What do they call that in English? Myrtle? I forget what it's called. And the Avankari are going to be the middlemen who are going to buy from the Goyim hadassim at a low price and sell it to the Jews at a higher price, make a profit. And Rav Huna has an instruction for them. Keys of Nisu, when you purchase. Asa means hadassim. May ovdei kochavim, from Goyim. We have a principle called stam gozel, meaning when you see a field and the Goyim are selling whatever they produce from that field, you have to assume that the Goyim took over a Jewish field. This was so common back in the time of the Talmud and throughout, unfortunately, Jewish history. And therefore, lo tigzizu atud, don't you cut down the hadassim, elo ligzizua inu biahuvile. Make sure that the Goyim who are selling you hadassim will first cut down the hadassim and then sell it to you. Don't you buy it and the guy will give you a document and he'll designate here the hadassim in this left part of the field, and the Jew, the Avankari, will go ahead and cut it down. My time. Why was Rav Huna so makpid that the Goyim should be cutting down the hadassim? More answers. Number one, stam ovdei kocham gazlone arasonin. We always have to assume the worst, that the field originally belonged to a Jew and the Goyim stole it from a Jew. So the karka on which these hadassim are growing was stolen from a Jew. It's a stolen field.